Hey everybody, it's Dr. Jackson, and today we're going to talk about British Romantic literature. And we're going to talk about the starts of it and some things that you need to know so that you can understand the poems that we're going to be reading over the next couple of weeks. One of the first things that I want you to understand about Romantic literature is that it really doesn't have anything to do with romantic love. Instead, what it has to do is about writers who wanted to form a personal expression about personal things. And they wanted to celebrate nature and what they considered to be natural behavior. So we're going to talk just a little bit about what that means over the next few minutes. So briefly, I want to touch on the era that precedes British Romanticism, and that is the Enlightenment, which we've been studying for the past few weeks. And just as with any time period in history, any literary movement, artistic movement, philosophical movement, you can't really sum it up in a word or two. It's much more complex than that. But just for the purposes of our understanding for this class and for what we're reading, let's just say that the Enlightenment was a time period in the 18th century where people wanted to use rational investigation and empirical evidence to try to perfect humanity. Now, that's really boiling that down to a very minute category. But if we had to learn one thing so that we can move forward, that's the thing that I would want you to know the most. So writers of this time period wanted to delight and instruct their readers as a way of perfecting their behavior and a way of working out any bad behavior, a behavior that wasn't good for society as a whole. And that's another thing about the Enlightenment. Those writers in general were very focused on protecting the whole universe and not just individuals. So very focused on the whole and on rational behavior. Empirical evidence is something that you could get from scientific experiment. And during the Enlightenment, interest and respect for science as a discipline really started to blossom. So if you've ever taken a chemistry class and you've done that test to see if something is a base or an acid, you've done the litmus test and gotten either the red or the blue litmus paper back, you've done something with empirical evidence. And that respect for science really changed the world. It certainly impacts what we do in our own world today. We respect science, we listen to science. And over, as we've been experiencing the pandemic, we've seen what happens when we do listen to science and when we don't listen to science. And so we have the Enlightenment thinkers to really thank for that. Sorry, I had to get a drink of water. I have some empirical evidence that I'm getting a little froggy there. Okay, so that's really the Enlightenment in a nutshell. Let's use rational investigation, not focus too much on human emotion, but see what we can do to make things better. And the United States is a product of Enlightenment thinking. The Declaration of Independence and our Constitution are evidence of that rational approach to the world. But while this is going on, you have other people who are thinking, that's all great, but what about human emotion? So we start to have a movement called Sturm and Drum, which is German for storm and urge. What you see in this movement, especially, is painters who depict scenes like the one you can see right now, where there's a lot of turmoil. And it seems what they were trying to get across to their viewers is, what do you do about the messy parts of life? Because there are parts of life that are messy. Just like in this scene, you can see this ship and you can see the waves and these people, their clothes are being tossed and they're pulling somebody out of the sea. A ship has capsized and this tree is starting to kind of bend and we've got all the rain and the storm. So what do you do with that? Excuse me. I'm having some Sturm and Drum right here with coughing. So sorry. So what do you do with all that messy part of life? And that was really appealing to some people who were rejecting that totally rational approach to things. As we've talked about in class before, we don't ever have a time period where people wake up and say, okay, it's Monday and the Enlightenment is over and now we're all going to do Sturm and Drum. It doesn't work that way. There's always overlap. So you'll still have people long after maybe the date that we would give for the Enlightenment being over, you'll still have people writing in that mode or thinking in that way. Just as while it's going on, you're going to have other folks saying, yeah, I don't like that. That's not really working for me. I need to have something else that I could look at. So Sturm and Drang is really one of the first indications that Enlightenment thinking is maybe on its way out the door a little bit. All right, then we have this guy, Wolfgang von Goethe. He was a German writer, famous writer, and he wrote a book called The Sorrows of Young Werther. It's actually a really good book if you decide that you want to read it. I've read it and really enjoyed it. It's about a young man named Werther, and Werther has a best friend, and the best friend gets this girlfriend, and Werther thinks the girlfriend is just, she is really hot. I mean, she's just totally it, and he kind of can't help himself, even though he knows it's his best friend's girlfriend. He finds himself more and more attracted to her, and she seems drawn to him too, although she's completely faithful to the boyfriend. So Werther just becomes so obsessed with the idea of being with this young woman that he cannot be with this young woman because she's got a boyfriend, that he commits suicide. Well, that's not always the option. If you're thinking about suicide, you need to stop and talk to an adult. There's a suicide hotline that you can call. You can talk to me, for Pete's sake. That's not really an appropriate response for I can't have somebody I love, because somebody else will come along. They always do. But at any rate, this book was super popular. And part of the reason it was popular is that people saw it as a rejection of this rational approach to life. Werther reacts from his feelings. He feels upset, he feels lost, he's emotional. And that was really appealing to somebody. And if you read this book, he's a very appealing character. He's lively and attractive and bright, and he just makes a bad decision at the end. Now, there are always rumors that there were copycat suicides because of this book. There's absolutely no factual basis for that rumor, but the book was a sensation, kind of in the way that maybe the Twilight books or the Harry Potter books were a sensation when they first came out. Werther was a sensation. Everybody was talking about it, reading it. It was just super, super popular. All right, then we have somebody else who's talking about feelings, and that is JeanJacques Rousseau. Rousseau was French. He's sometimes called the father of the French Revolution. And he was famous for saying, man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. Yep, there we go. That's on the next line. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. So a lot of people credit Rousseau for launching the idea that the French people who weren't particularly happy with their king, that they could get rid of him and that they could have a more democratic type of rulership. And of course, the French Revolution happens just right after the American Revolution. So those two revolutions start to get ideas brewing with people that if you don't like the way things are, you can rebel against it, and you can rebel in a really big way. Now, certainly both of those revolutions are violent. I don't know that we can quantify them. The French Revolution seems more violent because we know that so many people were killed with the guillotine, and that's, horrible, horrible way to die. But at any rate, the idea of revolution and rebelling against authority and rebelling against things that you think are unfair, that becomes a really popular idea with a lot of people. Then the Greek figure Prometheus, and some of you last semester may have done your mythology report over Prometheus. If you remember anything about him, he was not a god. He was just a mortal, and he stole fire from the gods and gave it to the mortals. And so his punishment is to be chained to this rock that you see him on. And he has this bird come and plucks out his liver every night. Then overnight, the liver regenerates and the bird comes and plucks it out again. And that's his punishment for eternity, for stealing fire from the gods. So that feeds, no pun intended, that feeds into the revolution idea. I don't like it. I can rebel against it. Yeah, I might get in trouble, but it might be worth it because now people have fire and they have something they can play with. So lots of more emotional responses than you might have seen during the Enlightenment. And there's always going to be somebody who says, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. That's what I want. Not that rational stuff. That doesn't work for me. I want to be emotional. And if I don't like things, I want to have some recourse, something I can do to get away from it. All right. Then we have, the startings of what we call British Romanticism. Now you're going to see all sorts of different dates for Romanticism. I've chosen these dates because 1798 is the date of a really important publication in Romanticism, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then 1850 is the date that William Wordsworth died. So I'll talk about those dates a little bit more, but you can see everything from 1789 to 1811, all sorts of different things, because there's no precision with something like this. So we do see lots of varying dates, but what I have here is what's sometimes called in scholarship the long Romantic period. Okay, so that we're going to look at a broader picture. All right, I've already talked about the French Revolution. Napoleon Bonaparte becomes a symbol of rebellion. He wasn't French, he was Corsican from a part of Italy, and he rebels and eventually becomes emperor and becomes the very thing that he said that he didn't want to have, and he gets exiled at the end of his life. But nonetheless, he's a major hero for a lot of people because he symbolizes the possibility of change. The possibility of change. And I think that's really what you see moving people with Bonaparte. All right, while all of this is going on, we see some writers start to embrace lyric poetry. Lyric poetry originated with the Greeks, and that word comes from this instrument this woman is playing. This is called a lyre. You can see that it's a stringed instrument. There are the strings right there, and she's plucking this. And she's in a very relaxed position. Lyric poetry comes from the lyre. So you know that if we sing a song and it has words to it, those words are called the lyrics. That's where that comes from. It's considered a high form of poetry. That means that it's supposed to be fairly difficult to do. But for whatever reason, it had fallen out of favor. And although I'm sure there were some people who were writing lyrics, it wasn't as popular as maybe some other forms of poetry. So you get these writers that we would now call romantics who start to embrace that form. You know what? Let's look at that. Nobody's done that in a while. Let's look at that and see if there's something we can do with it. It's kind of the same way that music artists will sample bits of old pieces of older music as a way to say, that was really cool. Why don't we look at that again? So it's that same type of sampling idea in a way. All right. The Lake District in England is important in British Romanticism because a number of the poets that we would call romantic come from that area. And you can see it's a pretty good distance away from London. It takes about 5 hours by train to get there. I've been there a number of times, and if there's a heaven, that it has to look like the Lake District because it's pretty amazing. In fact, I'm going to show you some pictures of it so you can see what I'm talking about. There are lots of lakes. Some of them are big, some of them are small. Some of them are called meres, M-E-R-E. Some of them are called waters, like Coniston waters. But there are lots of mountainous places, lots of blooming plants. It's very fragrant there because so many things blossom. Just about any flower you can imagine, with the exception of roses. And I was told those don't grow there because the deer like to eat them. So they probably would grow, but they don't get to prosper because the deer like to nibble on them. But at any rate, it's very lush and fragrant and just the most beautiful outdoor place that I've ever gotten to be. Really pretty. So I'm just going to show you some pictures of it so that you can see it and appreciate what it is, because these natural settings, natural, not contrived, not rational. The Romantics equated nature with being spontaneous. And for them, spontaneity was reflective of human nature because we are spontaneous. We do things erratically sometimes, not always out of rationality or empirical evidence. We just act. And so the Romantic poets tended to reject city life because they thought of it as artificial, as mechanized. As the Industrial Revolution started to really ratchet up, to steam up, so to speak, the Romantics really rejected it in favor of this natural setting because they thought it reflected something that was more appropriate for human behavior and more reflective of human behavior, and something that they wanted to seek out. And we're going to see that a lot when we study these poems, especially when we get to Wordsworth. We're going to really see the impact of nature on his poetry. So here's some other pictures. This is actually Wordsworth's home before he died. This is Rydal Mount. These are rhododendrons, and they smell amazing. They smell amazing. More rhododendrons. All right. The Romantics rejected the formal gardens of the Enlightenment because they're planned and artificial, and really, we're still doing that in a way. Think about it. Anytime you see a new building going up, what's the first thing that happens? Well, they dig up all the trees and the grass and all the flowers, and they level it off, and they make it dirt. And, here in Texas, we're out there in the summer mowing the lawn and watering the lawn, and so we're trying to control nature. And the Romantics didn't like that. It's not natural. It's not the way things are supposed to be. And so they rejected this idea of a really formal garden in favor of an English garden. And if you ever get to see an English garden, it's very unplanned. You'll have things of varying heights. You don't really have the neatly manicured lawn or trees that are clipped to be in some particular shape. You just let things be. You just let them run the way that they are. And it's really quite lovely and rather restful in a way that formal garden really isn't. All right, the Romantics also loved the mountains, and they loved the word sublime. And we may see that word as we study the Romantics. They liked the mountains because they're bigger than us. They have a grandeur, a scope, an enormity that we don't have. And so they make your eye go upward so that you can try to take all of that in. And of course, it's difficult for us to do that. If you've ever seen the Grand Canyon, it's so immense that you almost can't take it in. And the Romantics felt the same way about the mountains. They take you up and out of yourself, and they take you to the sublime, something that's more than what we can be as mere humans. So the Romantics really valued that high aspect, that perspective that being in a mountain or looking at a mountain could give, and that sublimity of experience that is, it's exceptional. It doesn't happen every day. And they valued that and sought it out, and they used that word sublime a great deal in their writing. And we'll see that as we go through. They also had a lot of reverence for childhood because children are natural. Now, in a lot of ways, up until this time, children had been treated as many adults, not really as a distinct experience in and of itself. Now, that doesn't mean to say that there weren't people who didn't revere children, love their children. Of course they did. Of course they did. But the Romantics wanted to put a focus on childhood because it's a time of innocence. And because of the Romantic idea of kind of reverting back to Greek and Roman ideas, that Roman idea, that's where we get that Romantic term. They kind of have an idea that comes from Plato, that we're all of us exist as a soul in heaven, and that soul is wise and has all the information that it needs. And then when we come to earth, we lose all that knowledge and spend the rest of our lives trying to gain it back. So for the Romantics, children were closer to God because they had been in heaven right before their birth, and because they respond and say whatever's on their mind. And I would be willing to bet that if you ask your parents, they could probably tell you some little story of something that you said when you were little that is very dear to them because their perspective was so open and sweet. I remember my son telling me he came home from kindergarten, and boy, would he die if he knew I was telling you this. He came home from kindergarten and he said, "You know what, Mom? Copycatters just like your ideas." And that's really nice. Now, that's not what most of us think about somebody who copies us. We don't want to be copied. But that perspective of his, that they just like what you're doing and they want to be like you, and that's really nice. That's why the Romantics valued children, because of their perspective, because of their honest approach and their take on life, that it's spontaneous, it's natural, it's not artificial, it's not hampered by what they should do, it's just from their heart. And so they really, really valued childhood and that childlike, not childish, because that's different, that childlike approach to looking at the world. The Romantics also appreciated peasants because peasants lived, for them, a more natural life. They're not hampered down by possessions. They don't have a lot of money. They live very simple lives. They work hard. They eat food that's more natural, that's not artificial. They don't have time for that kind of stuff. And so they valued peasants because of the simplicity of their lifestyle. So you may see peasants in what they write. That's fairly common too. They liked hermits. Hermits reject society. They openly reject society. Hey, I don't want to live around you. I'm going to go off and live by myself, and I want to live alone. Your parents may be thinking that right now because you're about to graduate from high school. Man, can they not wait until you get out of the house? And that's just natural. It's just natural. You'll see. But hermits live a quiet life of contemplation, and the Romantics found that really attractive. What if I were able to really get in touch with what I thought, if I lived alone so that I wasn't confused by all the other stuff that goes on in life and I could just focus on me? Wouldn't that be great? So they revered hermits, and hermits show up in their writing too. Likewise, they glorified monks and nuns because monks and nuns, live in a monastery or a convent, and they spend their life in quiet contemplation, and they take a vow of poverty. So they reject a lot of the junk that we do in life. They take a vow of obedience and poverty and chastity, so they're not going to have relationships sexual relationships with anybody. They're not really supposed to attach to the other monks or nuns where they're living. They're supposed to be detached and contemplative and thinking about their spiritual life. And so that was really attractive to the Romantics too, because it's more focused on self and self-contemplation and self-growth. And they really liked that idea a lot. They were interested in the Middle Ages. Now, it's pretty normal as humans for us to look back at a time that has passed as being more innocent, more simple, better somehow. You all may have 80s Day or 90s Day at school, which I just find appalling because I went to high school in the 80s. But that's really my issue. It's natural for us to romanticize the past, to look at it and think, wow, that was really better, when in fact it may not have been better. It may have been just about the same. We've just forgotten some of it because we're not involved in it. But at any rate, the Romantics were interested in the Middle Ages. A lot of their poetry takes place in the Middle Ages. John Keats has some marvelous poetry that we're not going to have time to look at this semester, but La Belle Dame sans Merci has a medieval setting, and there are lots of other poems that do too. So they were super interested in that. They liked Gothic architecture, something that would have been built in the Middle Ages. And this picture is going to be important to us when we talk about Wordsworth, and I'll show it to you again. This is Tintern Abbey in Wales. It's a ruined monastery. It's ruined because when King Henry VIII, that's the king, the big fat guy who had 6 wives and killed 2 of them, he dissolved all the monasteries, shut them down, because he had to break from the Roman Catholic Church in order to marry Anne Boleyn, his second wife. He couldn't get a divorce. So he broke away from the Catholic Church, and that was beneficial not only because he got to marry the woman he wanted to marry, but also because when he broke up those churches, he got all the money from them, and he was cash poor, so he really needed that money. And so there are all these ruined abbeys all over the UK, but Tintern Abbey is famous because Wordsworth went to it and wrote a really famous poem that we're going to study in depth. So they liked Gothic architecture. They liked the idea of verisimilitude. That's a really long word. It's a great word. It means the likelihood of being true. They liked anything that made it seem like it could be true. If you've read The Scarlet Letter in high school, it starts with the narrator being in the custom house in Salem, Massachusetts, and he says, it was a rainy day, and I really didn't have anything to do, so I went up to the attic, and I started going through stuff, and I found this scarlet letter A, and I started to wonder, what could this have been about? Well, having your narrator find this artifact makes it likely that the story that Nathaniel Hawthorne is going to tell us, it could be true. I don't know that it really matters if it's true, but the Romantics just loved that idea. So as you read Romantic literature, you'll see lots of things where people find a fragment or a scrap, or I found this little story and maybe it's true, or you'll have more than one person tell the story because more than one person's heard the story, so maybe it is true because we've heard this story. It's kind of the way, good golly, isn't there a TV show about people hunting for the Yeti because it could be true? Well, maybe it is. But the Romantics love that idea of verisimilitude. So you'll see lots of things that they put in their writing that could make it possibly be true. Real attractive to them. Now, Horace Walpole was a writer. He was also the son of the first Prime Minister of England, but he was a writer who's called the father of Gothic literature. So if you like anything that has vampires in it, or ghosts, or zombies, you really kind of owe that to Walpole, because he's the guy who so to speak, invented it. He wrote this book called The Castle of Otranto, and it's kind of fun to read. It's pretty silly. It starts with the hero, this guy. He gets killed because this giant helmet falls from up high in this castle. It falls on this guy and kills him. And of course, we know that could happen. It's just so silly and over the top, and people loved it because it was silly and over the top. It wasn't rational. It wasn't empirical. It was, this couldn't happen, but isn't that fun? And so it was really popular, and we owe that to Horace Walpole. So if you like anything like that, it's his fault. We've got good old Stephen King is still writing in that tradition, and I know that you have read Edgar Allan Poe, and we owe that to Horace Walpole because he's really the guy who got it going for us. This is his house. It's called Strawberry Hill, and it's a Gothic piece of architecture. You can see this turret right here and all these high spiky things, very Gothic. It's open as a museum. I haven't been to it, but I'd love to go. All right, then we have Sir Walter Scott. If you go to Edinburgh, Scotland, Walter Scott is the man. He wrote a whole bunch of books called the Waverley novels, and they were set largely in the Middle Ages, and they were so popular. People loved them. He was kind of like a rock star in his lifetime. As popular as like J.K. Rowling. Everybody's always fawning over her. Well, why not? She, got people reading, which is really, really great. But his novels were super popular. There's Ivanhoe and the Waverley novels. And if you like things that are set in the Middle Ages, that might be a thing for you. But he was super popular. And part of the reason these things are popular, too, is because they're taking stories that may have existed in the background of society, legends and fairy tales and that type of thing, and setting them down on paper as a way to preserve them. And so the Romantics found that really appealing too. Just because we know that story doesn't mean that we have ever been able to read it. We've just been told it. We saw that last semester when we were reading the Decameron. Those characters told each other stories that everybody seemed to have known, but nobody had written down. And so Boccaccio took the time to write those stories down and preserve them so that we can still read them. And Sir Walter Scott is kind of following in that tradition too, by taking those medieval legends and incorporating them. Larry McMurtry has done that in Lonesome Dove. He's taken all of these ideas that we have about Texas that we've romanticized about our background and written them in this book that celebrates those ideas. So it's kind of that, you see, these kind of things are still going on. They're still touching toes with what we're doing today. Then the Brothers Grimm. If you've read any fairy tale of any kind, you probably owe that to the Brothers Grimm for writing down Little Red Riding Hood and Cinderella and those stories that you grew up hearing. Well, those had been legends in their home. They were German, and they decided let's write them down. Let's preserve them for posterity. And so we have them to thank for those stories that are so pervasive in our culture that, if we say it's a Cinderella story, even if you've never seen the movie Cinderella or read the story, you pretty much know what that means because they preserve that for us. And it's pretty amazing, really. Then we have Robert Burns. Robert Burns is another Scottish writer. Again, if you go to Edinburgh, Bobby Burns, he's the man. Bobby Burns Night happens in January on his birthday, and people celebrate his birthday every year still, even though he's been dead for a long, long time. Robert Burns is important because he preserved the Scottish dialect. So if you sang Auld Lang Syne on New Year's Eve, should old acquaintance be forgot and ne'er be brought to mind, that's Robert Burns writing in Scottish dialect. And if you read his poems in the original, sometimes they can be kind of difficult to read because they're written in that dialect, but we know it because he wrote it down. He preserved it so it didn't disappear. And Romantics loved that. That's common language. It's not proper language. It's like preserving, if we're in Texas and I said I'm fixing to get a Coke, well, I might be getting ready to go and get ginger ale or some other type of soft drink. It doesn't mean I'm necessarily getting Coke. But other people who live in Texas understand I'm fixing to, because we say that all the time. Robert Burns is one of those people who took the time to write it down. I remember when we first started talking in the fall about language, a lot of you were really fascinated. How do we understand that? How do we know that that means that? Well, it's people like Robert Burns who take the time and travel to write it down so that we have that part of our culture, that rich, important part of our culture, preserved in literature. Right? So he's really famous too, very influential on the Romantics. All right. Now, I told you that when we started talking about the Romantics that we were going to talk about this date, 1798, in an important book. And this is that important book, Lyrical Ballads. It's one of the most important books ever published, ever, because it revolutionized the way people approach poetry. It was written by two men, these best friends, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and we'll read some of his poetry, and William Wordsworth. We're going to read him too. They were best friends. They were poets. They met nearly every day, and they really saw eye to eye about what they thought poetry should be. What they thought it should be was a personal expression, and that it should include the language of ordinary men. By that they mean the language didn't need to be elevated. They didn't need to use big words. In fact, they were a lot more interested in using language that pretty much anybody could understand so that their poetry could be accessible to just about anybody. That was really interesting to them. They wanted to use that lyric form that we talked about just a few minutes ago. It had fallen out of favor. They liked it. They wanted to use it. They also wanted to use ballads. That's why the name of the book itself, Lyrical Ballads, is revolutionary, because you've got these two forms of poetry, the lyric, which is a high or difficult form of poetry, and ballads, which is a low or easy form of poetry, and you put them together in one work. Now, you're familiar with ballads, even if you think you aren't. A ballad is a type of song or a type of poem that has a story attached to it. So, a lot of country music has really good stories. Carrie Underwood, in particular, boy, is she good at telling a story. Before he cheats, you know the story of that. The guy cheated on her, so she did the only thing you could do. She went and wrecked his car. Well, that's not really the only thing you can do. But ballads are always popular. They're really accessible. Usually the language is easy enough that you can memorize the story pretty quickly. And the thing about ballads as songs is when they come on, even if they're really old, there was a song that was popular when I was in high school. If you like Pina Coladas, I bet you money you've heard it. People know the words to that song because it has a really great story to it. So Wordsworth and Coleridge did something that at the time was revolutionary. They took a high form of poetry, the lyric, and a low form of poetry, ballads, and they put them together in one book. Now, Wordsworth wrote more poems than Coleridge did. The only poem of Coleridge's in this original edition is The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. But it's a super long poem. And when the book came out, that was the thing that really captured people's attention, was The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, because it was so different. It's a story about a sailor who's on a ship, and an albatross lands on the ship, and he kills it for no reason. And then he has to wear that albatross around his neck as a punishment. And we'll talk more about that when we get to Coleridge in a few days. But it was, man, did it sell well. It sold so well that it actually went into a second edition. And in the second edition, Wordsworth wrote this in the preface. And you might want to copy it down somewhere in your notes just so that you can have access to it, because it's a really important quote, and it kind of sums up what Coleridge and Wordsworth were trying to do. Wordsworth wrote, "Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility." That sounds really pretty. Sounds really nice. Is it that big a deal? Yeah, because up until the time that Coleridge and Wordsworth wrote Lyrical Ballads, there was a pretty persistent, pervasive idea that poetry had to be inspired by some type of muse, and that you had to have certain topics to write about. You know, maybe you needed to talk about a king or some important event in life, or maybe you're telling a Bible story or a story from Greece or Rome, or you're telling some pretty important thing. Coleridge and Wordsworth just didn't believe that. They thought that it was important enough to write down, you know what, today I was out walking and I saw this field of daffodils and it really rocked my world. That was so startlingly different when they published this book that it took the world by storm, and it changed the way that people perceived poetry and the way that people wrote poetry really up until the current day. It's still influential, that idea that we want to know what people think and what they feel, and that personal response is just as important as paying attention to our culture as a whole. So you can't diminish or underestimate the importance of this work to really open up, break open in a significant way literature and poetry just all together. It's really kind of amazing. So, all right, that's it for right now, and we will talk more